start. We can start.
Go ahead, Ma.
The movie's done. Yes, I think you can start. Hello, everybody. And thank you for joining us for this panel with the High Representative Federica Mogherini, who needs no introductions. Mogherini, recently, the EU's facing unprecedented challenges in the last few years. As of a year ago, you outlined a new global strategy for security and defense. This has also been followed by a series of different strategies, migration compacts, and others. Could you please elaborate a little bit on this strategy and where this vision for how the EU can address not only the internal challenges it is facing as an entity, but also how it can engage with the rest of the world at times of considerable global uncertainty?
Yes, well, first of all, let me say how glad I am to be here and to see so many friends in the room. It's always a pleasure to be back. And also to see that Italy and Rome exercises this convening power around the Mediterranean that we really need in these times. So good to be back home. Indeed, last year, 1 year and a half, I presented the European Union Global Strategy. And I remember very well the mood that time was not the best possible one. It was 2 days after the UK referendum, a few months before the US elections that brought quite some changes in the White House and in Washington and in the global scene. And people were talking about the European Union as being in the midst of crisis, challenges, turmoil, to be elegant, let's say, much more. Many were even saying this is going to be the beginning of the end, and the European Union project will simply collapse. 1 year and a half after that, we see that actually all around the world, from Australia to Central Asia to Latin America to the Mediterranean or Africa, people are asking for Europe to be the reliable, strong partner that we are in the world. I'm not saying this is thanks to the global strategy we presented, but this is because we might have many difficulties and many challenges internally, but Europe has more than anything else a big strength, which is the fact that we are, first of all, reliable. People in the world might not like everything we do. Sometimes we have big discussions about human rights or rule of law standards we promote around the world. But people can rely on us. And this, I think, is in these times of global uncertainties and challenges, serious ones, the most valuable element that a global player can bring to the global dynamics. And if you look at the reality of facts, we are the most advanced area of the world when it comes to trade. We are the biggest market in the world, the biggest investor in the world everywhere, the biggest donor when it comes to humanitarian aid or development assistance. We are increasingly a security provider, and maybe I'd say a few words on this. And we are the main trade power in the world. But again, it's not just about economy, as it's always perceived. It's increasingly about diplomacy, prevention of conflicts, management of post-conflict, and a certain way of conceiving international relations that I think is rooted in our history. I think the turning point for the European Union perception, self-perception and perception in the world, was actually here in Rome in March, when we celebrated the 60th anniversary of the Rome Treaties, where the 27 remaining member states realized that what we risk to lose is not only 60 years of peace, but also a certain idea of living together. In the world, what is appreciated in Europe, is not only the high standards, the quality of life, the culture, the economy, but it's mainly this thing that we realized, thanks to our history, that making cooperation rather than confrontation is more convenient. And this is the real essence of the European, also the European foreign policy. The win-win rather than the zero-sum game. At the end of the day, the European Union started when we all realized that making business together was much more convenient than making war to each other. And this is a lesson that the rest of the world is interested in these times. And that could apply to many different regions. I'll come to security for a second. You asked to elaborate, and that's very dangerous to do with someone that can speak for hours, but I won't. Because Europe has always been perceived as a soft power. And we are. We are the strongest soft power in the world. But people sometimes underestimate the fact that we're also a global security provider. I give you two examples. I was 1 hour ago on the phone with the Foreign Minister of the Republic of Korea, discussing with her how the European Union can support a peaceful way to get to the objective of a denuclearized Korean peninsula through diplomacy, but also through pressure, economic and diplomatic pressure. And that is security, because the nuclear threat today is a security threat that is worrying us much more than conventional threats. Second example, yesterday, the day before yesterday, I was in Abidjan at the European Union-African Union Summit. And in Africa, the European Union, under EU flag, has more than 10,000 women and men in uniform, helping, training, supporting security forces of our partners in Africa to work on African approaches to security, countering terrorism, countering criminal networks and organizations, traffickers, and assisting the peace and security in Africa in a way that nobody else does in the world. We've trained so far more than 30,000 African policemen or policewomen, because there's always this gender angle that we try to bring in, judges, legal system reforms, security system reforms, in a way that always matches this hard power, but also this civilian approach that always needs to be mixed. So I think that we have now positioned the European Union as a credible security player, and exactly this month, 2-3 weeks ago, 23 member states of the European Union notified with a formal letter to me, after more than a year of work, their intention to launch a permanent structured cooperation on defense. Other two are going to join us. I see here my good friend Rose Guttemöller. This is going hand in hand with an excellent and strengthened cooperation between the European Union and NATO. We are next European Council, 14th of December, going to have the most relevant step in the creation of the European Union of Defense and Security, which is the formal launching of the permanent structured cooperation. So member states investing together, researching together, buying together, and operating together on the field in a way that was never done, was always perceived as an important element of the European project since 60 years, always failed, and today we've done it. And I think that this can be a model also for expanding and deepening the work we do in our union in other fields.
And how do you think that this will apply sort of concretely on the ground in the Mediterranean basin? Is the main goal anti-terrorism? Is it stemming migration? And are we really sure that it can be sort of complementary to what NATO does rather than in sort of competition?
The history about, the story about competition between the European Union and NATO has no ground. Maybe it belongs to the past. But as Jens Stoltenberg rightly referred to it, it's ghosts of the past. We have to face realities of the present and the future. And this is what we are doing today. The best symbol of the fact that deepening and strengthening the European Union of Defense goes hand in hand with deepening and strengthening EU-NATO cooperation is the fact that the very same day, I think it's the 5th or the 6th of December, 5th, thanks Rose, you see, that's perfect cooperation. The very same day when we will most probably have the final decision on the permanent structured cooperation legally, it's also the day when both councils, the European Union and NATO, will approve further set of measures that we will do together in the field of hybrid threats, in the field of maritime security and other things. So in the same week, in the same days, we take formal decisions on strengthening the European Union defense capabilities and work in a way that is really historic, never done before. And in the same week, in the same days, we are advancing the cooperation with NATO in an unprecedented historic way. So the two things are going exactly together because of one simple reason. We face the same challenges, and we have different set of instruments. NATO is mainly a military alliance. It's also a political alliance, but it's mainly a military alliance that has strong military means and consolidated structures. The European Union is the only actor in the world, the only player in the world that matches some elements of our power and some elements of capability also of deployment on the ground, because there are places where we are deployed, think of Africa, where NATO is not, because of the nature of the intervention we need, mixing in particular the civilian and the military work we do. I think of the training of the kind of force like gendarmerie and things like that. So the mix of defense, military, security, interior, justice, rule of law, that is a growing field of needs that our partners have. And we have instruments that NATO doesn't have that are purely non-military. Think of the development cooperation angle that sometimes reinforces the work we do on the ground. Which are the priorities? You mentioned the Mediterranean. First of all, let me say one thing very clearly. I would always refuse to consider the migration phenomenon as a security challenge. That is in a different box. We're talking about a global phenomenon there that is not a security threat. It's a humanitarian challenge we have to face. Talking to the security threats, what we're facing is clearly a terrorist activity that has internal and external implications. We have the nuclear threat that is coming back, and we thought it was something belonging to the past. And we have the instability, and I would say the temptation of going into geopolitical games that, especially in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, are extremely risky. And sometimes I have the impression that we're playing with fire without realizing that the fire could go further on the way. But again, I think that for Europe, the main threat, the main challenge that needs to be tackled is the prevention of conflicts and the prevention of the exposure of large parts of population, especially in Africa and the Middle East, but also in Southeast Asia, to poverty, to deprivation of rights, to lack of access to resources, including resources for developing your own life, and radicalization. And this is what requires this mix of elements and work, from the hard power to the police, to the economic investments and development cooperation. I give you an example. For the European Union, what is key is developing more security in the area of the Sahel. Obviously, it's close neighborhood for us. Here in Rome, that's quite easy to understand it. But I think this is clearly understood also in the north of Europe now. And for the first time, I'm seeing this year a real understanding everywhere in Europe that Africa is a priority number one. And the Estonian presidency has done an enormous amount of activities exactly to strengthen this European Union, African Union partnership. But there, you take the Sahel, you need to train the security forces of these countries and equip, sometimes, them to do the job in an area that is a desert, very difficult to monitor for any, even of our European countries to do. You have to have targeted development projects to allow communities, and especially the young people of the area, to have opportunities of life that avoid them falling into different kind of activities like smuggling of people, drugs, arms, or terrorist organizations. You have to fight the climate change. That is a security challenge because desertification or climate change impact pushes people either away from their communities, but also into different kind of activities rather than agricultural or traditional economic activities. So everything is linked. The purely military approach sometimes is needed, but is never sufficient by itself. And this is the European approach to security.
This is a kind of a perfect segue into the Middle East. What role do you see for the EU in a context where we're not only seeing a withdrawal of the US, we're seeing greater Russian assertiveness in places like Syria, but above and beyond that also we're seeing greater polarization between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And we saw what happened in Lebanon over the past few weeks with the resignation, not resignation, forced resignation, not forced resignation of the Prime Minister of Lebanon. So perhaps you can, and at the same time we have a situation in Syria where the current president seems to be staying. So what role do you see for the EU in a situation where the kind of political processes that are being put in place may actually set us on a path to greater instability rather than greater stability?
You know, I think the role of the European Union in the Middle East is quite clear. We have a traditional role there that is I would say, the one that is often given for granted, the humanitarian one. I start from that because if you look at the amount of money, sorry if I get to trivial things, that the European Union and its member states is putting into, for instance, assisting Syrians, both inside Syria and in other countries, it's probably more than the double of what all the rest of the world together has put into that. And this is not charity. This is a way of guaranteeing that Syrians survive, because there will be no Syria without Syrians. And now, after so many years of war, and still the war is continuing, and we have to remember that the fighting in some areas of Syria is still going on, it's still awful, it's still targeting civilians, and things are not back to normal. They're improving in certain areas, and this is good news, but the war is not over. We're not there yet.
There are areas under siege.
There are areas under siege, there are civilians under attack, and the first concern of the European Union is always people. Somebody call us naive, but for us, the value of life, of people, comes first. Always, always. So I start from that. We are the biggest humanitarian donor, and our role, including in the Middle East, this is also true for other areas of the world, but our role is first of all to keep people alive, to guarantee that people have access to education, children, health assistance, food and water, and that their life continues first. Again, somebody say, you're just a humanitarian player. Well, that's people. That's people's life first. Second, we have a fundamental role on the economic side. I remember, I think last year I was sitting here with Safwan discussing the situation in Syria. And a lot of things have changed since then. But what has not changed is this idea we have developed together with the United Nations and with many others, and many of them I see in the room, of starting to prepare peace in Syria and the future of Syria and the region. The strongest possible leverage the Europeans can put on the table of the political process in Syria is, again, sorry if I go back to trivial things, is the money. A country like Syria and the region and the neighbors that have been hosting so many refugees for so many years, the local communities, would need an enormous amount of economic resources to restart normal life when peace will be reached. And again, I stress, we're not there yet. We have started last year with a Brussels conference that has now turned into a Brussels process. We will have a second conference in April 2018, and we will continue because the reconstruction and the rehabilitation of Syria will last probably for years when it will start. We have started this work to prepare the international community, the region, but also the Syrian players, to look at ways in which we can start to support local reconciliation processes, local rehabilitation, the delivery of services, the going back to normal life in some areas where this is possible. And where is it? First, where the fighting has stopped and the ceasefires have started to work, the de-escalation zones. Not many of them. And I would like to see the three guarantors of the Astana process, Turkey, Russia, and Iran, to deliver more on what they have already started to achieve in terms of bringing down the violence. But we need to see more of that. So in areas where the situation calms down from a military point of view, in areas where political reconciliation and sharing of power starts, and communities come together, and the plurality of the identity of the Syrian people is recognized and welcomed, we can start financing the going back to normal life. It's not humanitarian. It's not yet the reconstruction. The reconstruction money will come, at least from the European Union and the international community at large, only when a peace agreement will be reached in Geneva under the UN auspices. And that will require an enormous amount of resources. But in between, if the de-escalation zones manage to bring calm to areas, we can start allowing Syrians to have normal lives again. This would require a political environment that makes it possible to happen. And here I would like to say the role of the United Nations is key. I imagine that, I know you heard Minister Zarif yesterday, and I think you will hear Minister Lavrov this afternoon. A lot of talks about Sochi. I think that anyone that can bring any of the political players in Syria to come to serious negotiations on the future and on the transition in Syria, the future constitution, the elections, is very much welcome to do so. But it has to be clear, to use a sentence that in Rome is quite popular, it has to be clear that all roads lead to Geneva, and that the political process is a UN-led process that needs to deliver there. Otherwise, the credibility, the legitimacy, and the sustainability of any outcome, I would say realistically, would simply not be there. We need to show the Syrians that we are able, as international community, to unite forces and ask them to find ways of living together. I think it is not impossible, and I'm quite encouraged by the round of talks that Staffan has had in these hours in Geneva. But we need to make clear that this is not a game, this is not a chessboard, where what is important is who has more influence over the other. This is a war with victims on the ground, with hundreds of thousands of lives destroyed, and with a country destroyed, and with a region close to be destroyed. So we have to be responsible and serious and understand that anyone that can contribute to finding a political solution has to come together under the UN umbrella and help that process to deliver.
Can you mention a few words about Lebanon?
Lebanon. I was meeting my Lebanese friends these days, and I was saying, I don't know if this is an international say, but we found out that it's a Lebanese saying and it's an Italian say. So, and Lebanon and Italy have many things in common. We understand each other well. Lebanon is like a cat, 9 lives, and probably many more. And like cats, you always land on feet, luckily. Because Lebanon could have been, and could be, as always, the place where you see and you read the entire dynamics of the region. If Lebanon finds its way, it's because the region manages to live together. I wouldn't go further than that. Live together. Whenever there's a crisis in Lebanon, it's because the entire region is dragging into a major crisis. And I was very worried over the last weeks. And I'm very relieved and very happy that Prime Minister Hariri is back to Beirut. And that political parties, political forces, institutions are joining in unity, which I know is a very difficult unity. But that's life, that's Lebanon, that's politics. I mean, we don't expect this to be easy. But the fact that everybody is restarting to make institutions work, I understand there will be normalcy of works of institutions as of next week. I think it's an extremely important thing. Also because, let me be very frank, I visited Lebanon many times in this 3 years now I'm in this position, and obviously before also many times as an Italian minister. We finally got to the point this year, earlier this year, that a government was in place and the cabinet was regularly meeting, an electoral reform was passed, a budget law was passed, the parliament was working, the president was elected. After many years of stalemate, which still was allowing Lebanon to continue to function, because this is the magic of Lebanon, but finally we managed to have institutions in place and working institutions in place. It would have been a disaster to see this going back. I think that Lebanon has the wisdom, and Lebanese political forces and people have the wisdom to understand that their policy of distancing from regional conflicts is a wise one that needs to be supported by all, and I see all supporting this. I think this is extremely important to preserve the unique mix of everything that Lebanon is. And I think it is going to be essential in the coming days and weeks and months, heading to elections in spring, that the international community, starting from the European Union, will continue to support Lebanon on this way of wisdom, restraint, and focus on the Lebanese people priorities. I think it can be done. And I think that in the coming days we will have also further occasions to discuss about this together.
When you look at the Iran deal, clearly it has been a top priority for the EU. What can you do to salvage it?
Why do you talk to the past? It is.
I mean, what can you do to salvage it if the US imposes snapback sanctions in January?
The nuclear deal we achieved with Iran is a key security priority for Europe and for the region. President Trump mentioned in his speech on the Iran strategy of the US that the United States will consult with allies on the way forward. And the message we have sent as the European Union and its member states, all the 28 extremely united and clear, is this: preserving the nuclear deal with Iran and its full implementation in all its parts by all is a key security priority for Europe. That's a starting point. Not because we're particularly friends. The deal has been negotiated and finalized in a way that actually contains so many provisions and so many different elements of control, with the most intrusive system of verifications from the IAEA, exactly because there was no trust when we had the agreement in place. And by the way, it's 104 pages of detailed elements on every single aspect of nuclear activities. So anyone that thinks of renegotiating one chapter or another, or one paragraph or a line or another, simply doesn't know what kind of box it's opening. Every single word is linked to the previous and the next one. And something like that was negotiated with excellent technical teams, I have to say a word of praise for the European Union team that physically drafted every single word of that. Simply doesn't understand the complexity of that. So no possibility of renegotiating parts of it partially. Key priority for us to keep the full implementation of it. This is the message I've delivered to President Rouhani several times, last time in August during my, my visit to Tehran for his inauguration speech. And this is the message I'm bringing to Washington. Europeans expect everybody to stay compliant with the agreement and to fulfill their commitments in full. This deal doesn't belong to one or another. It's a UN Security Council resolution. Actually, technically, it's an annex to a UN Security Council resolution. So you cannot get out of the deal. You cannot dismantle the deal. You can decide not to implement a UN Security Council resolution, and that's a sovereign choice. But the deal is part of the UN system, and it's an international agreement. I was mentioning the summit we had, European Union, African Union in Abidjan the other day. And the African Union were one of the first to release a statement after the announcement by President Trump of his decision not to certify, that the African Union expects the nuclear deal with Iran to stay. And it's not part to the agreement. It's because it belongs to the international community. It's because it's working. 9 times the IAEA has certified that Iran is fully compliant with all the commitments. So the deal is there to stay. It doesn't belong to one or another, but it requires commitment from all to be implemented. First of all, from Iran. First of all, from Iran. And again, my message has always been very clear. We expect, as Europeans, Iran authorities to continue to fulfill strictly to the full implementation of the deal. Then there are other things we can discuss that are not under the scope of the agreement. The agreement was decided to be purely on nuclear issues. Was it right? Was it wrong? That is an historical debate now, because the decision back 14 years ago was to limit the negotiations to purely nuclear-related issues. Personally, I would have probably thought that it would have been a good entry point to discuss also regional issues, because at the end of the day, the problem is that the Middle East at large and the Gulf requires to develop its own security architecture that makes it possible for neighbors to live together even if they don't like each other, as we Europeans have done for decades, including the Cold War. This was not the choice made back then. It was decided to limit negotiations to purely nuclear aspects, and now this is what we have. But dismantling an agreement that is working on nuclear-related issues would not put any of us in a better position to discuss of all the rest, regional dynamics, conflicts, missiles, programs, development, and things like that. Preserve the deal, keep what is working, and let's work in the same cooperative manner, which doesn't mean trust, but means finding the common ground on all the rest.
I think we're
out of time?
Yes.
Already.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is excellent.